call came at 0347 hours. Not the kind of call that starts with pleasantries. Not the kind that allows time to pour coffee or splash water on a tired face. The kind that arrives in the dead space between sleep and wakefulness. When
Good
the
hit.
mind
Hold
is
for
still
next.
half dreaming and the body
Target
hasn't
is hot.
yet remembered
Wind is
what it is,
negligible.
Copy.
what it
Holding
can
breath.
do,
Send it.
what
Firing.
it has survived.
Hit. Center
The
mass.
kind of call
Target
that
down.
changes the temperature
Reacquire.
of a room
Copy.
just
Next
by
target
existing.
locked.
Send it.
Captain Elena Vasquez reached for her phone before
Target
the
acquired.
second
Wind
ring
at 2.
finished.
Sending
her hand
it.
moved before her eyes opened.
Hit. Center mass.
Muscle memory. 7 years of it. The screen burned white in the darkness of her quarters at Fort Bragg, and she was already sitting upright, feet on the cold floor, spine straight, before the voice on the other end had spoken 3 words. Vasquez. Langford. Get to the TOC. Now. Colonel James Hartwell. She recognized his voice the way a sailor recognizes a particular wind. Not by sound alone, but by what it carries with it. Hartwell didn't call people to the Tactical Operations Center at 0347 for anything that could wait until morning. She was already pulling on her boots before the line went dead. The air outside was November cold, the kind that pressed through fabric and found the skin underneath with quiet efficiency. Fort Bragg at night had a particular quality to it, a stillness layered over constant readiness, like a blade left on a table. Clean, patient, waiting. Elena moved across the compound with her collar turned up, her breath coming in short white puffs, her mind running through what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew, a window had opened somewhere. A target, an asset, a problem that required solving at distance. What she didn't know, why Colonel Hartwell had called her specifically. That part sat in her chest like a stone. She pushed through the TOC door and the room hit her immediately. 6 people already inside, standing around the central table, a satellite image glowing on the main screen. The air smelled of stale coffee and tension. 2 of the 6 looked up when she entered. The other 4 kept their eyes on the screen, which told her everything about the seriousness of what was being discussed. She clocked the faces in sequence. Lieutenant Commander Daryl Brick Mason, SEAL Team 4, a man built like his nickname suggested, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. Master Sergeant Kevin Park, 75th Ranger Regiment, short and precise and perpetually underestimated. Staff Sergeant Lena Torres, Intelligence. Captain David Rees from the 160th SAW, the helicopter crew. And in the corner, arms crossed, leaning against the wall with the particular ease of someone who had been in far worse rooms than this one, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. She knew Webb by reputation. Everyone in the Special Operations community did. 12 years in Naval Special Warfare. Designated sniper. Confirmed engagements that were the kind people spoke about in hushed voices during training exercises, using them as benchmarks, as reference points for what the human body could achieve when properly trained and properly still. Webb didn't look at her when she entered. He was studying the satellite image with the focused patience of a man who reads landscapes the way others read sentences. Colonel Hartwell stood at the head of the table. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, with a kind of face that had long since stopped registering surprise. He gestured at the empty space beside Park without preamble. Vasquez, glad you're here. We've got a situation in the Paktika province. 11 hours ago, an asset codenamed Cardinal was compromised. He's currently being held at a compound 40 clicks northeast of Sharon. Cardinal has been running a network for 18 months. If he talks, and they will make him talk, we'll lose 32 active contacts, 2 ongoing operations, and the better part of a year's intelligence work in the Eastern Corridor. Hartwell paused. We can't extract him. The area is too hot, too watched. ISR shows 4 guard positions, 2 roving patrols, and a QRF that can be on site in under 6 minutes. The only viable option is a precision engagement from the Eastern Ridgeline. 1 shot, 1 subject, clean termination. The room absorbed this in silence. Then Brick Mason spoke, and his voice carried the particular texture of a man who has already run the numbers and decided he doesn't like them. What's the distance to the ridgeline? Elena asked quietly. Hartwell looked at her steadily. 2,387 meters. The number landed in the room and settled there. 2,387 meters. Just under a mile and a half. At that distance, A bullet is no longer simply a projectile. It becomes a calculation, a negotiation with physics. Wind drift, bullet drop, Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation, the Doppler shift of thermal currents rising off desert ground, the precise heartbeat of the shooter, the half-second window between exhale breath and the body's next involuntary movement. At 2,387 meters, a rifle shot stops being a shot and starts being a mathematical proposition. Webb finally turned from the satellite image. His eyes found Elena with the measuring quality of a man who assesses range instinctively, who looks at a distance the way a carpenter looks at a board, calibrating automatically, silently. "That's the longest confirmed kill in current theater records," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was simply a statement offered to the room. "It is, Hartwell confirmed." "I can take it," Webb said. It was a statement without arrogance. A statement the way a surgeon might say he can perform an operation. Matter of fact, grounded in demonstrated ability. Then Elena said, "So can I." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Not with anyone dropping anything or turning in surprise. The shift was subtler than that, the way air pressure changes before weather arrives. Brick Mason's eyes moved to her. Kevin Park went very still. Hartwell's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A careful recalibration, a reassessment of what the next few seconds required of him. Webb looked at her. He took his time about it. "You Vasquez," he said. Not dismissive. Factual. "I am. 43rd Special Forces Group." "That's right." Webb nodded slowly. Then he looked at Hartwell. "Sir, with respect, the shot I'm describing requires." "I know what it requires," Elena said. Her voice was even. Not defensive. Not heated. The voice of someone who has been in rooms like this before and has learned that temperature is the enemy of precision. "And I'm telling you I can take it." The silence that followed had a specific quality. The quality of men in a room recalibrating who they thought they were talking to. Hartwell looked at Elena for a long moment. Then he said, "Vasquez, you on the mission. As the secondary shooter. Webb takes primary." He turned back to the satellite image before she could respond. "We move in 6 hours. Get your kit. Both of you. I want a full prep brief at 0600. The dismissal was complete. Professional. Clean. Elena turned toward the door. Behind her, she heard Mason mutter something to Park, low and under his breath, something she caught only the end of. It was enough. She kept walking. In her quarters, she moved with deliberate economy, the movements of someone who has packed for hard places many times and knows that hesitation costs weight and weight costs distance. She pulled her case from beneath the bunk and opened it on the floor. Inside, packed with the particular care of a craftsperson, lay her primary weapons system, a MK-21 precision sniper rifle, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, with a Night Force Attica scope zeroed at 1,000 yards and adjusted from there. The rifle was 4 to 7 inches long and weighed 14.5 pounds empty. She had put over 8,000 rounds through it in the past 3 years. She knew its character the way you know a language you have spoken since childhood. Not consciously, but in the body, in the hands and the eyes and the decisions made before thought catches up. She checked the barrel, the bolt, the trigger assembly. She checked the scope mounts. She ran a bore light through the chamber and studied the rifling by feel as much as sight. Then she laid the rifle across her lap and began assembling her kit with the quiet attention of someone who understands that the details between now and the shot were the shot. There was no separation. She was still working when her door opened without a knock. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway. He was carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He looked at the rifle in her lap, then at her face, then at the rifle again. He held out a cup. She took it. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "It's a free country." He sat on the footlocker across from her and wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at her rifle without speaking for a moment. There was no condescension in the silence. There was something else in it, something that might have been assessment or might have been the beginning of curiosity. 43rd Group, he said. "You did the pipeline at Bragg. And Picatinny. And the advanced course at Quantico." She set down her coffee and reached for her cartridge roll. "I've also been to SOTIC. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. the most advanced long-range precision fire training in the United States military. It produced perhaps 40 graduates a year, and the washout rate was something that the instructors discussed without apology. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I know what SOTIC is," he said. "I know you do." Another silence. She began laying out her cartridges in sequence, checking each one by hand, feeling the case neck, the primer pocket, the bullet seating. 40 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum, hand-loaded, each one with a 250-grain Sierra Match King bullet seated to a depth she had measured personally on a precision micrometer. The variance across 40 rounds was less than 0.003 of an inch. She had loaded them herself the previous week, the week before the call came, because she loaded ammunition the way some people maintain journals, regularly, carefully, as a form of preparation for something she could not yet name. Webb watched her work. After a while, he said, "That's hand-loaded." "Yes, you do your own loads." "Since the first year." He was quiet for another moment. She could feel him recalibrating, the way you can feel a scale adjusting when weight is added to it gradually. She did not look up from her cartridges. "The guys in there," he said finally, meaning the TOC, meaning Mason and Park and the rest, "they don't know you." "I noticed." "They will." She set down the cartridge she was holding and looked at him for the first time since he'd sat down. He wasn't looking away. His face had the quality of someone who has seen enough of the world to have reached a kind of flatness about it. Not coldness, but the calm of a person who has sorted what matters from what doesn't and left the sorting behind them. "Is that why you brought the coffee?" she asked. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Just briefly. "No," he said. "I brought the coffee because I wanted to see your rifle." She looked at the MK-21 in her lap. And nothing," Webb said. "It's a good rifle." He stood, finished his coffee in one long pull, set the tin cup on her footlocker. "I'll see you at the 0600 brief." He was already at the door when he stopped and turned back, almost as an afterthought. "Vasquez, at 2,387 meters, the Coriolis is going to run you about 3 inches left at that elevation and latitude. You'll want to bake that into your firing solution before we go, not on the position." He left. She sat for a moment, holding her half-finished coffee and looking at the space where he'd been. Then she nodded to herself, precisely, and went back to work. The 0600 brief was held in the same TOC room, but with additional personnel. A CIA liaison named Shepard who wore civilian clothes and had the eyes of a man accustomed to rooms he was not supposed to be in. An Air Force ISR analyst who went by the call sign Oracle and who ran the imagery from the drone feed with the mechanical confidence of someone who trusts data over intuition. And a young Ranger Corporal named Darius Hayes who had been attached to the op as comm support. 19 years old, quiet, with a notebook he was filling in a careful, cramped handwriting that suggested he treated every word as something to be saved. Hartwell ran the brief with his characteristic economy. The compound was a former agricultural structure, stone walls, approximately 40 meters by 60 meters, with a main building in the northeastern quadrant that intelligence placed Cardinal in. The compound was occupied by a mid-tier facilitator known as Operator Kilo, a logistics coordinator for a network that had been responsible for 3 IED events in the previous 6 weeks. Cardinal had been attempting to document Kilo's network when he was compromised. The precise mechanism of the compromise was not yet known. That was, as Shepard noted with quiet emphasis, a problem for another day. Today's problem was Cardinal. If he remained alive in that compound for more than another 14 hours, the intelligence assessed with high confidence that coercive interrogation would reach the stage where he would begin giving accurate information. Cardinal had a family, a wife, 2 children, a daughter of 11 and a son of 7. In a suburb of Kabul. He knew this. He would hold out as long as a person can hold out against things that are not designed to be survived with silence intact. 14 hours was optimistic. 10 was realistic. The ridgeline sits 2,387 meters to the east-southeast, Hartwell continued. Elevation difference of approximately 340 meters above the compound. Wind data from the past 72 hours shows a consistent north-northwesterly at the ridgeline averaging 11 miles per hour with gusts to 17. Temperature at mission time is projected at 4 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Density altitude calculations give you an effective range reduction of roughly 90 meters due to the thinned air. He looked around the room. You've got one window. Cardinal will be moved from his current holding room to a secondary location for secondary interrogation at 14:30 local. The transfer takes him across a courtyard. He'll be exposed for between 8 and 15 seconds, depending on his condition. He paused. 1 shot. 1 second. In her quarters, she moved with deliberate economy, the movements of someone who has packed for hard places many times and knows that hesitation costs weight and weight costs distance. She pulled her case from beneath the bunk and opened it on the floor. Inside, packed with the particular care of a craftsperson, lay her primary weapon system, a Mk-21 precision sniper rifle, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, with a Night Force Attica scope zeroed at 1,000 yards and adjusted from there. The rifle was 4 to 7 inches long and weighed 14.5 pounds empty. She had put over 8,000 rounds through it in the past 3 years. She knew its character the way you know a language you have spoken since childhood. Not consciously, but in the body, in the hands and the eyes and the decisions made before thought catches up. She checked the barrel, the bolt, the trigger assembly. She checked the scope mounts. She ran a ball light through the chamber and studied the rifling by feel as much as sight. Then she laid the rifle across her lap and began assembling her kit with the quiet attention of someone who understands that the details between now and the shot were the shot. There was no separation. She was still working when her door opened without a knock. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway. He was carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He looked at the rifle in her lap, then at her face, then at the rifle again. He held out a cup. She took it. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "It's a free country." He sat on the footlocker across from her and wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at her rifle without speaking for a moment. There was no condescension in the silence. There was something else in it, something that might have been assessment or might have been the beginning of curiosity. 43rd Group, he said. "You did the pipeline at Bragg. And Picatinny. And the advanced course at Quantico." She set down her coffee and reached for her cartridge roll. "I've also been to SOTIC. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. The most advanced long-range precision fire training in the United States military. It produced perhaps 40 graduates a year, and the washout rate was something that the instructors discussed without apology." Webb was quiet for a moment. "I know what SOTIC is," he said. "I know you do." Another silence. She began laying out her cartridges in sequence, checking each one by hand, feeling the case neck, the primer pocket, the bullet seating. 40 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum, hand-loaded, each one with a 250-grain Sierra Match King bullet seated to a depth she had measured personally on a precision micrometer. The variance across 40 rounds was less than 0.003 of an inch. She had loaded them herself the previous week, the week before the call came, because she loaded ammunition the way some people maintain journals, regularly, carefully, as a form of preparation for something she could not yet name. Webb watched her work. After a while, he said, "That's hand-loaded." "Yes. You do your own loads." "Since the first year." He was quiet for another moment. She could feel him recalibrating, the way you can feel a scale adjusting when weight is added to it gradually. She did not look up from her cartridges. "The guys in there," he said finally, meaning the TOC, meaning Mason and Park and the rest, "they don't know you." "I noticed." "They will." She set down the cartridge she was holding and looked at him for the first time since he'd sat down. He wasn't looking away. His face had the quality of someone who has seen enough of the world to have reached a kind of flatness about it. Not coldness, but the calm of a person who has sorted what matters from what doesn't and left the sorting behind them. "Is that why you brought the coffee?" she asked. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Just briefly. "No," he said. "I brought the coffee because I wanted to see your rifle." She looked at the Mk-21 in her lap. And nothing," Webb said. "It's a good rifle." He stood, finished his coffee in one long pull, set the tin cup on her footlocker. "I'll see you at the 0600 brief." He was already at the door when he stopped and turned back, almost as an afterthought. Vasquez, at 2,387 meters, The Coriolis is going to run you about 3 inches left at that elevation and latitude. You'll want to bake that into your firing solution before we go, not on the position. He left. She sat for a moment, holding her half-finished coffee and looking at the space where he'd been. Then she nodded to herself, precisely, and went back to work. The 0600 brief was held in the same TOC room, but with additional personnel. A CIA liaison named Shepard who wore civilian clothes and had the eyes of a man accustomed to rooms he was not supposed to be in. An A-Force ISR analyst who went by the call sign Oracle and who ran the imagery from the drone feed with the mechanical confidence of someone who trusts data over intuition. And a young Ranger Corporal named Darius Hayes who had been attached to the op as comm support. 19 years old, quiet, with a notebook he was filling in a careful, cramped handwriting that suggested he treated every word as something to be saved. Hartwell ran the brief with his characteristic economy. The compound was a former agricultural structure, stone walls, approximately 40 meters by 60 meters, with a main building in the northeastern quadrant that intelligence placed Cardinal in. The compound was occupied by a mid-tier facilitator known as Operator Kilo, a logistics coordinator for a network that had been responsible for 3 IED events in the previous 6 weeks. Cardinal had been attempting to document Kilo's network when he was compromised. The precise mechanism of the compromise was not yet known. That was, as Shepard noted with quiet emphasis, a problem for another day. Today's problem was Cardinal. If he remained alive in that compound for more than another 14 hours, the intelligence assessed with high confidence that coercive interrogation would reach the stage where he would begin giving accurate information. Cardinal had a family, a wife, 2 children, a daughter of 11 and a son of 7, in a suburb of Kabul. He knew this. He would hold out as long as a person can hold out against things that are not designed to be survived with silence intact. 14 hours was optimistic. 10 was realistic. The ridgeline sits 2,387 meters to the east-southeast, Hartwell continued. Elevation difference of approximately 340 meters above the compound. Wind data from the past 72 hours shows a consistent north-northwesterly at the ridgeline averaging 11 miles per hour with gusts to 17. Temperature at mission time is projected at 4 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Density-altitude calculations give you an effective range reduction of roughly 90 meters due to the thinned air. He looked around the room. You've got one window. Cardinal will be moved from his current holding room to a secondary location for secondary interrogation at 14:30 local. The transfer takes him across a courtyard. He'll be exposed for between 8 and 15 seconds, depending on his condition. He paused. 1 shot. 1 second. The sky was clear, which was both good and bad. Good for visibility, bad for heat shimmer across the valley floor as the afternoon sun worked at the ground. She could already see the mirage running in the scope, a slow southward drift that confirmed the wind direction and gave her a reading on its behavior at mid-range. She began her firing solution. In her notebook, in a handwriting as precise as her cartridge preparation, she wrote the numbers. Muzzle velocity of the .338 Lapua with her specific hand load, 2,945 feet per second. Time of flight to 2,387 meters. Approximately 2.8 seconds. Bullet drop at that distance. She calculated from her notebook, cross-referenced with the temperature and density altitude correction. Total drop, 634 MOA at sea level, adjusted for the elevation and temperature to 581 MOA. Wind drift at 11 miles per hour from the northwest, at this angle to the target bearing, 31.2 inches at the 9 o'clock position. Coriolis effect at this latitude in the direction of fire. Approximately 3.1 inches left, as Webb had mentioned, already incorporated. Spin drift, the natural clockwise drift of a right-hand twist barrel at extreme range, 5.2 inches right, which partially offset the Coriolis. She adjusted her scope with the specific, careful movements of a clockmaker, each click representing 1/4 of a minute of angle. Each minute of angle representing approximately 1 inch at 100 yards, so at 2,387 meters, approximately 2,610 yards. Each click move point of impact approximately 6.5 inches. She made the adjustments, checked them, made them again to verify. Behind them, Hayes was on the radio, relaying their position to the TOC, where Hartwell and the rest of the team were watching the compound through the drone feed. The drone's camera was fixed on the courtyard. Oracle's voice came through Hayes's earpiece in a steady, emotionless stream of real-time intelligence. 2 guards on the north wall, 1 moving east. The holding room was quiet. Cardinal had not been moved. Window opens in 93 minutes. Hayes reported, relaying Oracle's timeline. 93 minutes. Webb was already in position. His eye was to the scope. His breathing was already settling into the long, disciplined rhythm of a man preparing for sustained precision. The breathing of someone who has learned to inhabit stillness the way others inhabit movement. Elena checked her scope once more, laid her cheek on the stock, and looked downrange. At 2,387 meters, the compound filled a relatively small portion of the scope's field of view. The courtyard was a pale rectangle. The guard at the southeastern corner was still there, still with his hands in his pockets, still looking outward with the habitual vacancy of a man whose guard shift has run too long and whose vigilance has become performance rather than function. She found the doorway that the intelligence brief had identified as Cardinal's exit point. Wooden double doors, painted a faded blue that had bleached to something closer to gray in the constant sun. She put her crosshairs on the threshold. This is the place, she thought. This is where everything either is or isn't. She steadied her breathing. Beside her, Webb was still. The wind pressed against them with quiet, impersonal persistence. Hayes murmured into his radio. Somewhere behind them, on the approach trail, Park was working his security position. The afternoon light changed color slowly, as Afghan afternoon light always does, pulling toward gold from the white of midday. 93 minutes became 80. 80 became 60. Time moved the way it moves in positions like this. Not fast, not slow, but with a specific weight, each minute pressing down with the accumulated gravity of everything that has led to this ridge, this scope, this distance. Mason's voice came through the command net at the 90-minute mark. He was in the TOC with Hartwell, watching the drone feed, and his voice had lost some of its earlier texture. It had the particular quality of a man watching something happen that is still calibrating his understanding of. Vasquez, he said. Webb, what's your status? Position set, Webb replied, low and even. Firing solution complete. There was a pause. Then, Vasquez. Solution complete, she said. Ready. A longer pause this time. Then Mason said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite any single thing. Copy that. The wind shifted at the 50-minute mark. Not dramatically, not a gust, not a reversal, but a backing, moving from north-northwest to more nearly north, which changed the crosswind component against her firing line by approximately 4 degrees. She watched the mirage in her scope for 30 seconds, confirmed the shift, and made a small adjustment to her wind correction. Beside her, she heard Webb make an identical adjustment without her mentioning it. They had reached the same conclusion at the same moment. She registered this without comment. At the 40-minute mark, Hayes relayed that Oracle was reporting increased movement inside the compound. A vehicle had arrived at the western gate. 2 additional personnel had entered the main building. The activity pattern was consistent with preparation for movement. Cardinal's transfer was being organized early. Window may open ahead of schedule, Hayes reported, his voice carrying the specific strain of a 19-year-old trying to sound like he has delivered bad news in the field before. Copy, Webb said. Elena said nothing and adjusted her grip. At the 32-minute mark, the blue-gray doors opened. She saw it before Webb called it, the split-second gap between perception and announcement, the way the brain processes visual information before the mouth catches up. 2 figures in the doorway, one supporting the other. Cardinal, visible even at this distance by the way he moved, the particular movement of a person whose body has been recently and seriously persuaded, the head inclined, the gait broken, the posture of someone being held up as much as held. Beside him, a man with a hand under his arm, and ahead of them, a third figure beginning to cross the courtyard. Movement, Webb said, low and steady. Target visible. Confirmed, Elena said. Her crosshairs were already there. already resting with the specific softness of a properly cheek-welded shooter on the exact point in space where Cardinal's transfer would pass through the one angle that provided a clean shot without risk to other bodies. She had identified this angle during the initial scope survey and had returned to it twice since. She had been waiting for it for 32 minutes. Primary has solution, Webb said. Her finger was on the trigger guard. Feeling it. Not the trigger yet. The guard. Waiting. The courtyard crossing was roughly 12 meters. At Cardinal's current speed, she estimated 10 seconds. The clean window would open at approximately the 4-second mark, when Cardinal would be clear of the doorway structure and not yet adjacent to the northeastern building's shadow, which was moving as the sun continued its descent. She counted. 1, 2, 3. Wind shift, she said quietly. Webb said, confirm. The mirage in her scope had shifted again, subtly, a slight backing that she was reading in the flow of heat shimmer at mid-range. The 4-degree backing she had accounted for was now something closer to 7. She recalculated in real time, fractions of seconds and fractions of inches interacting in the circuitry between her eye, her brain, and her hands. 7 degrees north, she said, recalculating. There was a pause, a very small pause. In the TOC, Hartwell and Mason and the rest were watching the drone feed and watching the seconds count down and watching a man cross a courtyard who had 14 hours of resistance behind him and none ahead. Primary holding, Webb said. It was a professional statement. It was not uncertainty. It was the acknowledgement of a man who had just been given information that changed his firing solution and was being honest about it. 4 seconds had become 3. 3 had become 2. She had her solution. I have it, she said. 1 second of silence from Webb. In that second, she understood. He was doing everything a sniper of his caliber would do in a second like that. Running the new data, checking his own calculation, weighing the outcome. Vasquez, he said. I have it, she said again. Cardinal reached the 4-second mark. The window was open. She exhaled. Halfway out, her crosshairs rested on a point 31.7 inches to the right of her intended impact point, because that was where the wind would carry her bullet from, arriving from the right, pushed left by the 7-degree north crosswind. Her heart was at 54 beats per minute. She felt the space between beats. Found it. She pressed the trigger. The rifle spoke once. Not loudly. With the suppressor fitted, the Mk-21 produced a sound closer to a heavy book dropped flat on a hard floor than anything resembling the crack of a weapon. A compressed, mechanical sound, businesslike and brief, followed immediately by the supersonic whip crack of the bullet departing the muzzle at 2,945 feet per second and entering the cold Afghan air on a trajectory that would take it 2,387 meters before it intersected with the physical world again. Elena kept her eye to the scope. This was the part that untrained observers never understood about long-range shooting. The work didn't end with the trigger press. It continued through the entire 2.8 seconds of the bullet's flight, reading the conditions, reading the trace if it was visible, reading the impact point when it arrived, calling the shot, knowing what happened. This was what separated a sniper from a shooter. The shooter fired and hoped. The sniper fired and watched. And the watching was itself a form of accountability that could not be delegated. 2.8 seconds. At extreme range, 2.8 seconds is both very short and very long. Short enough that nothing dramatic seems to happen in the world. Long enough that a wind shift of 2 miles per hour will move a bullet 4.5 additional inches by the time it arrives. Long enough for doubt to visit the untrained mind. Elena's mind was not untrained. She watched the mirage. She watched the trace. She breathed out the remaining half of her breath with steady, deliberate patience. The impact came at the 2.8 second mark. Through the scope, at 2,387 meters, the resolution of the image was such that she saw the confirmation she needed without being able to see the specific detail of it, which was appropriate, because what she needed to confirm was a result, not a spectacle. What she saw was Cardinal going down, not violently, not in the way of movies, but in the way of physics, a body whose structural integrity has been instantly compromised by a 250-grain copper-jacketed projectile traveling at a velocity that the human body is not designed to absorb. He went down. The guard beside him spun toward the sound of nothing, because there was no sound at this distance worth hearing. And in the spinning there was confusion, and in the confusion there was the 3 to 5 second gap between event and response that the mission brief had calculated for. It was enough. Impact confirmed, Elena said. Her voice was level, the voice of a professional reading a result. A half-second of silence on the net. Then Hayes, in a voice that tried very hard to be calm and didn't quite achieve it, said, "TOC, this is Ridge. Confirm impact, over." Hartwell's voice came back from the TOC, and in it there was something that rarely surfaced in Colonel James Hartwell's communications in the field. A frequency of relief, barely there but unmistakable to anyone listening carefully. "Ridge, this is TOC. Drone confirms. Target is down. Mission is complete." Elena lifted her eye from the scope. The ridge was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago. The wind was pressing against her from the north. The sky was pulling toward gold. The compound, 2,387 meters to the southwest, was now a small rectangle of growing chaos, figures moving, a vehicle starting, the QRF response initiating, which was exactly what the mission brief had predicted and which was now irrelevant to the outcome. She began field stripping her bipod. Webb said nothing for a moment. He was still in his position, his eyes still to his scope, conducting his own observation of the compound's response. Then he slowly sat back on his heels and looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has known abstractly for a long time and has now encountered in physical form for the first time. He said, 7-degree backing wind, recalculation under 4 seconds, first-round impact at 2,387 meters. She was working on her bipod. "Yes, that's not a secondary shooter," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a recalibration of fact, stated plainly. "I was whatever the mission needed," she said. Webb looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. Not the casual nod of social interaction, but the specific nod of professional acknowledgement, weighted and deliberate, the nod that one craftsperson gives to another after watching them work. Behind them, Hayes had stopped writing in his notebook. He was staring at Elena with the particular expression of 19 years old encountering something it will be processing for the rest of its life. Park appeared from the southern end of the ridge, where he had been maintaining the security position, moving with the low, efficient crouch of a ranger who has been watching an approach corridor for 50 minutes and is now transitioning out of that role. He came alongside Elena as she was sliding her rifle into its case and looked at her once, the way Park always looked at things, briefly, comprehensively, and with the minimum number of words required. "Nice shot," Park said. "Thank you," she said. That was the entirety of the exchange. It was enough. The extraction took 40 minutes. They came off the ridge faster than they had gone up, the weight of achievement doing something to the physical task that mathematics alone doesn't account for. Hayes stayed close to Elena on the descent, not conspicuously, but with the unconscious gravitational pull of someone who has just witnessed something and is not yet sure how to sort it into the categories they have for the world. At one point, on a particularly steep section where the shale was uncertain underfoot, he came alongside her and said, quietly, over the noise of the wind, "Captain Vasquez, that wind shift. How did you calculate that so fast?" She looked at him briefly. He had his notebook in his outside pocket, the corner of it visible above the zipper, and he had a look on his face that she recognized, the look of someone who is genuinely asking a question, not performing one. "I didn't calculate it fast," she said. "I calculated it slowly, for 3 years, until I could do it quickly." She glanced at the notebook in his pocket. "Are you keeping notes on the operation?" He looked slightly uncomfortable. "I keep notes on everything." "Good," she said simply, and kept descending. The Black Hawk was waiting in the valley with its rotors turning at flight idle, Reese at the controls, and the crew chief standing at the door with the patient readiness of someone who is always the last one to know if the mission went well. They loaded in sequence, rifles first, then personnel, and the helicopter lifted before the doors were fully closed, banking southwest in the fading light with the urgency of a machine that knows its route and runs it without sentiment. On the flight back, the radio crackled from the TOC. It was Hartwell. His voice came through the crew chief's headset and into the aircraft's comms loop. Ridge elements. This is TOC actual. Well done. All elements well done. A pause. Vasquez. That shot has been relayed to SOCOM. They want a full debrief on the firing solution. Elena keyed her MIC copy. Sir. Ready when you are. Another pause. Then Hartwell said something she would think about for a long time afterward. In a quiet way you think about things that land differently than you expect them to. He said, Vasquez, I want to say something on this net, for the record. That was the longest confirmed precision engagement by a U.S. military operator in this theater this year. I want you to know I am aware of exactly what that took. She held the microphone button for a moment without speaking. Then she said, the target is down, sir. That's all it took. A brief silence. Copy that, Hartwell said, and signed off. Across the aircraft, Mason was looking at her. He had been in the TOC for the shot, had heard it called, had watched it on the drone feed, and he had the specific expression of a man who has recently had the architecture of a held assumption disassembled from underneath him and is now standing in the gap between what he expected and what happened. It was not a comfortable expression. It was an honest one. The helicopter noise made conversation technically difficult. He leaned forward anyway. I owe you an apology, he said. He had to raise his voice slightly over the rotor wash, which stripped the statement of any diplomatic softening and left it bare and direct. Probably more direct than he had intended, but more true for it. Elena looked at him. She studied his face the way she had studied the mirage in her scope, reading it for what it was actually telling her, not for what she wanted it to say. What are you apologizing for? She said. He seemed slightly caught by the question. The TOC. This morning, when you said you could take the shot. You didn't believe me, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a confirmation of fact, stated without heat. No, Mason said. I didn't. That's not an apology-worthy offense, she said. You didn't know me. You'd never seen me work. Doubt before knowledge is rational. She held his eyes. What would have been worth apologizing for is if you'd known and still doubted. You didn't know. Mason was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. You're more generous than I expected, he said. I'm precise, she said. There's a difference. Something in Mason's face changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of the movies where a character's transformation is announced with swelling music and a convenient close-up. It changed in the way faces actually change, slowly and from the inside. A reconfiguration of underlying assumptions that would take days to fully settle but had begun here, in a Black Hawk over Afghan terrain, with a woman who was more precise than generous talking to a man who had just had his mental model of the world quietly revised by reality. He nodded. Not the fractional nod he'd given before. A full nod. The kind that means something. Webb, who had been listening with his eyes closed, said without opening them, she was SOTIC top graduate. Class of 2019. He paused. I was an instructor that cycle. Silence in the aircraft. The particular silence of several people absorbing the same information simultaneously. Mason looked at Webb. You knew. I knew when she named the wind shift in 4 seconds, Webb said. The SOTIC grad I remembered. She used to do that problem set in 3. He finally opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of the Black Hawk. I brought her coffee to see her rifle. I was wrong about why I was bringing it. The admission sat in the aircraft for a moment, and nobody commented on it. Because in the company of people who do serious work, honesty about being wrong is not treated as a vulnerability. It is treated as evidence of a functioning mind. The debriefing at Fort Bragg began at 2,200 hours and ran until past midnight. Elena sat at the main table with her notebook and her firing data and went through the shooting solution with a methodical completeness that the SOCOM liaison, a colonel named Beckett who had flown in from Stuttgart for reasons that suggested the mission had implications beyond what had been briefed at the original TOC session, described afterward as the most comprehensive post-engagement technical record he had seen produced in the field without access to a ballistic computer. She had done it by hand, in a notebook, on a ridgeline in the cold. Beckett said this to Hartwell in the hallway afterward, not knowing Elena was close enough to hear. Hartwell said, with the particular dryness of a man who has now had access to information he wishes he'd had earlier, she's been doing it by hand since the first year. Doesn't fully trust the computers. Beckett said, why not? Because, Hartwell said, and Elena heard the pause before he said the next words as if he was choosing them with care. The computer doesn't feel the wind. She did not round the corner to acknowledge she had heard this. She went back to her seat and finished her debrief notes. And when Beckett came in and shook her hand with the careful formality of a man who is recalibrating his understanding of a situation while trying to appear as though he is doing no such thing, she shook it once and let it go. It was past midnight when Hayes found her in the break room. He was still in his field kit, which suggested he hadn't been to his bunk yet, and he had his notebook open in his hands and the look on his face of someone who has been working up to a question for several hours. "Can I ask you something, Captain?" he said. She was cleaning her rifle at the table. The Mk-21 was field-stripped again, not because it needed it, but because the ritual of the cleaning was itself something she valued. The attention it required, the respect it implied. "You can ask," she said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which she noted with approval. Hesitation was a habit she found more corrosive than boldness in people who are still learning. "I'm going to try for Sutik," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while, but—" He stopped, looked at his notebook. "Today changed something. I mean, the way you read the wind shift, the way you made the calculation under time pressure. I want to understand how you get to that point." He looked up, "Not just mechanically. I mean, how do you get to the point where you trust yourself that much, under that much pressure?" Elena finished cleaning the bolt assembly and set it down on the cloth. She looked at Hayes with the particular attention she gave to people who were asking real questions rather than performing curiosity. "You just said you've been thinking about Sutik for a while," she said. "Yes, but something was stopping you." He hesitated. "I wasn't sure if I had the right profile for it. You know, the unit I'm in, the background I come from, He stopped himself. "People around me haven't encouraged you," she said. "Hadn't noticed me," he said. And the precision of the correction, its honesty, its quiet weight, made her set down the cleaning cloth entirely and give him her full attention. She thought about something for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. "Darius," she said, and the use of his first name shifted the register of the conversation. "The people who haven't noticed you, their failure to see you is data about their attention, not about your capability. Do you understand the difference?" He was quiet, writing nothing for once, just listening. "I spent 4 years in this uniform before I sat in a TOC room where anyone expected that the call sign attached to the longest shot in theater would have my name on it. 4 years. And in those 4 years I loaded ammunition by hand, logged every shot in notebooks that nobody asked to read, studied meteorology and exterior ballistics and Coriolis calculations in rooms by myself at times of night when the rest of the building was dark." She picked up the bolt assembly again and continued her work. "I wasn't waiting to be noticed. I was becoming undeniable. Those are different things." Hayes looked at his notebook, looked at her. Then he opened to a clean page and wrote something in that careful, cramped handwriting, and she didn't try to read it, because it wasn't for her. It was for the version of him that would read these notes in 3 years, sitting somewhere harder than this, needing to remember why he started. "Apply for Sutik," she said. "First available cycle." "Yes," he said. She went back to her rifle. He sat for another minute, and then he got up, and at the doorway he turned back. "Captain Vasquez," he said. She looked up. "That shot today," he said, choosing words with the deliberate care of someone who wants to be precise rather than merely complimentary, "was the most extraordinary thing I have ever personally witnessed." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with complete sincerity, "The shot was math and physics and practice. The extraordinary part was Cardinal holding out long enough for the window to open." She set the clean bolt into the receiver. "Give the extraordinary to the right people." Hayes absorbed this, nodded once, in the way that Webb had nodded on the ridge, full, weighted, meaning something. Then he left. The break room was quiet after that. The bass sound continued in the background, the distant rhythm of a place that never fully stopped, generators and vehicle engines, and the occasional radio transmission bleeding through walls. Elena finished reassembling her rifle in the methodical sequence of someone who takes maintenance as seriously as preparation, which is to say, absolutely seriously. When the Mk-21 was fully assembled, she dry-fired the action once against an empty chamber to feel the trigger brake, the clean 2.5-pound pull she had adjusted herself and tested 100 times. Exactly as it should be. Consistent. Reliable. Honest. She set the rifle in its case, closed and latched it, and sat for a moment in the quiet. She thought about Cardinal, about his family in Kabul, about his daughter, 11 years old, and his son, 7. About the phone call they would receive or the absence of a phone call, whichever form the notification took, and about what they would be told about how it ended, which would be some version of the truth, filtered through the institutional language of people who have learned to deliver painful information cleanly. She thought about the 14 hours that had been available and the 10 that were realistic and the way the mission had compressed all of that into a single moment on a ridge in cold light. About the 2.8 seconds between trigger press and impact. About the fact that 2.8 seconds had been, in some meaningful sense, the whole point of 3 years of hand-loaded ammunition and midnight ballistic study and a scope she had maintained with the care of someone who understands that the lens between her eye and the world was not a metaphor. She thought about Mason in the helicopter, about the architecture of assumptions and how long it takes to build them and how quickly they can be revised by a single undeniable fact. She thought about Webb, who had brought coffee to see her rifle and found something else entirely. She thought about Hayes, writing in his notebook in the careful, cramped handwriting of someone who intends to remember. Then she stood up, lifted the rifle case, and walked to the door. At the doorway, she turned off the break room light. The room went dark behind her. She moved down the corridor toward her quarters, rifle case in hand, footfalls even and quiet on the concrete floor, a woman in a building that was already preparing its next set of problems for her. Because that was the nature of the work, the problems kept arriving, and the answers required preparation that never really ended. In 3 weeks, she would receive a written commendation from SOCOM, signed by a general whose name she knew from training manuals, citing the engagement at 2,387 meters and the demonstrated proficiency under time-compressed conditions. The commendation would be filed in her official record. She would read it once, on the day it arrived, fold it, and put it with the others. In 6 weeks, she would stand in a room at Fort Bragg with Hartwell and Beckett and a small group of personnel who had been briefed on the operation, and she would receive a decoration that would be presented without public ceremony, as such decorations often are, handed over with the particular quiet gravity of acknowledgement that does not require an audience to be real. Hartwell would shake her hand with both of his, which was not a thing she had seen him do before. Mason would be standing in the back of the room. He would not say anything, but when she caught his eye, he gave her the nod, and this time there was nothing ambiguous about its weight. In 8 weeks, Hayes would submit his application for SOTIC. He would include in his personal statement a paragraph about operational precision under time-compressed environmental conditions that read, to anyone familiar with what had happened on that ridge, as a clear and deliberate tribute. He would be accepted into the program. 4 months later, on a Tuesday morning with a low gray sky over the training ranges, Elena would be running a qualification course when she heard her name called from the adjacent range. She would look up to find Hayes standing at 600 meters, a rifle she didn't recognize in his hands. Something new, something he'd clearly been given by the program. And he would be looking at the target with the expression of someone who is standing in the very early stages of a commitment that will define years. He would see her and raise his hand in acknowledgement. She would raise hers in return. That would be enough. The morning she left for her next assignment, a pre-dawn departure in February with frost on the ground and a sky the color of old iron, Elena loaded her kit into a vehicle with the economy of a person who has done this many times and has long since made peace with the repetition of it. Rifle case, rucksack, notebook, the current one, 3/4 full of firing data and meteorological observations and the kind of marginal calculations that most people would not understand and that she valued precisely because most people would not understand them. Webb was there. She hadn't expected him. He was standing by the gate with his hands in his jacket pockets and the look of a man who came to say something specific and is now deciding whether the something specific requires saying or whether the act of showing up has already said it. She stopped beside him. "New assignment," he said. "Yes. Where?" She gave him the region without the detail. which was the appropriate amount of information to give and which he accepted without asking for more, which told her everything she needed to know about him. "What's the range?" he said. She almost smiled. "Almost. They haven't told me yet." Webb nodded. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out something and held it out to her. A small card, military issue, with a radio frequency written on it in precise block letters. "In case you need a spotter," he said. She took the card and looked at it. The frequency was one she recognized from an earlier operation, a cross-unit coordination net that technically required authorization to access and which both of them understood to mean something different from what it said on paper. "I won't need a spotter," she said. "I know," he said, "but the number's there." She put the card in her jacket pocket. She got in the vehicle. The driver pulled forward. She did not look back, because looking back at things that were settled was a habit she had never cultivated, but as the gate passed on her left and the base fell behind them and the gray February sky pressed down on a flat road heading toward an airfield and a flight and a place with different problems waiting, she felt the card in her pocket with a clear, quiet awareness. The road ran ahead. The mission ran ahead. Everything runs ahead in this work. The preparation and the execution and the quiet afterward and then the preparation again. Because the preparation is not a prelude to the work. The preparation is the work, and the woman who understands that, who loads her own rounds and studies wind at midnight and makes calculations that take years to compress into seconds, that woman does not wait to be seen. She becomes undeniable, and the next ridgeline is always waiting. Ghost never rests. The airfield at Bagram was never quiet. Even at 0430 hours, when the sky was still the deep, bruised purple of pre-dawn and the frost had settled in a thin, even crust across the tarmac, the place operated with a continuous, overlapping energy of a machine that had long ago forgotten what stillness felt like. Cargo loaders moved in the distance. AC-17 was running its engines at the far end of the runway, the sound a deep, chest-pressing vibration that you felt before you heard. Ground crews in reflective vests moved between aircraft with the purposeful indifference of people whose shift had started hours ago and would end hours from now, and in whose world the arrival of one more vehicle carrying one more operator with one more rifle case was simply another data point in a long, unbroken stream of data. Elena sat in the passenger seat of the MRAP and watched the airfield through the windshield and ran through her list. It was a habit she had developed in the first year, the list. Not a written list, a mental one. Every piece of kit accounted for not by checking bags but by visualizing each item in sequence, its location, its condition, its readiness. Rifle, ammunition, 40 hand-loaded, 20 factory backup. Scope, zeroed, protected, mounts torqued to specification. Notebook, current volume, backup volume. Meteorological kit, Kestrel 5700 weather meter, spare batteries, lens cloth. Medical, tourniquet, pressure bandage, hemostatic gauze, morphine auto-injector. Radio, charged, frequency loaded, cryptocurrent. Personal, what the professional didn't cover, the small, private inventory of the human being underneath the operator. She completed the list. Everything was where it should be. The driver, a young specialist named Cortez who had been assigned to her for the transfer and who had said exactly 4 words since they'd left Fort Bragg, said, "Flight's on time. Wheels up in 40. Copy," she said. They pulled through the gate and onto the tarmac apron and stopped near the C-17's off-ramp. Elena stepped out into the cold air and felt it immediately, the particular quality of Bagram cold, drier than the cold back home, with an edge to it that the thin air at elevation gave to everything. She shouldered her rucksack and picked up the rifle case and walked toward the ramp. There was a group of soldiers near the ramp, waiting to board. 7 of them, a mixed element from the look of the unit patches, with the compact, loaded bearing of people who were going somewhere that required being loaded and compact. They were talking among themselves in the low, joking register of a team that knows each other well enough to be easy, the banter covering something more serious underneath, the way that it always does in this work. She walked past them toward the cargo hold. One of them, a staff sergeant with a ranger scroll and the kind of jaw that suggested he had been told he had a good jaw often enough that he had stopped noticing it, looked at her rifle case as she passed. He said something to the soldier beside him, low, with a slight smile. She caught the word toy in it. Nothing more, just the one word. The same way you catch a single instrument in an orchestra, isolated for a half-second from the whole. She kept walking. At the top of the ramp, an A-Force loadmaster named Technical Sergeant Brenda Ochoa was directing the cargo configuration with the focused authority of someone who runs her domain with precision that people consistently underestimate until they've seen the consequences of ignoring it. She looked at Elena's rifle case, checked her manifest, and pointed to a red nylon seat along the port side wall. Case goes in the rack, Ochoa said. Or under the seat if it fits. Your call. Under the seat, Elena said. The case was 4 to 7 inches long and fit under the web seat with 2 inches to spare, which she had verified before departure because she always verified clearances before departure. She sat down and buckled in and put her hands on her knees and watched the rest of the passengers load. The staff sergeant with the good jaw boarded last, still talking to his teammate, still carrying the easy energy of someone for whom this flight was one in a long series and had therefore been largely normalized. He sat 3 seats down from Elena. When he settled and looked along the row and noticed her, something in his expression reorganized briefly. The particular reorganization that happens when a mind that has made an assumption encounters the possibility that the assumption may need revisiting. He looked at her. She looked forward. The C-17's ramp began to close. In the noise of the aircraft, conversation was again technically difficult. Again, it happened anyway. The staff sergeant leaned toward her, slightly, projecting his voice over the engine noise without quite shouting. What unit? He asked. 43rd Group, she said. He nodded with a specific nod of someone who is placing this information within a framework. Long-range precision. Yes. He looked at the rifle case under her seat with something that was not quite skepticism and not quite curiosity, but somewhere in the zone between the two where people spend a lot of time before they have enough information to move in either direction. What system are you running? Mk-21, she said. He raised his eyebrows slightly. That's a serious rifle for... He stopped himself. He had enough situational awareness to hear the sentence before he finished it and make the decision not to finish it, which was a form of intelligence, even if the beginning of the sentence had already said most of what the rest of it would have. For, she said. He had the decency to hold her gaze. I was going to say for a solo deployment, he said, which was not what he had been going to say, and they both knew it, and his knowing that she knew it was visible in the slight adjustment of his jaw. I'm not solo, she said. I'm advanced element. He nodded. What's the range you're going into? Haven't been briefed the full detail yet. Ballpark. She looked at him then, fully, with the steady measuring attention she gave to environments and wind and distances. He had the look of someone who was genuinely curious rather than performatively interested, and she found that she could work with genuine curiosity. Wherever it needs to be, she said. The C-17 began its takeoff roll. The noise climbed to the level where individual conversation became too costly, and the exchange ended there, suspended in the way that conversations on military transport always seem suspended, left unresolved in the air, to be picked up or abandoned depending on what the next destination brought. She looked at the ceiling of the aircraft and felt the wheels leave the ground. Somewhere in the middle of the flight, in the gray half-sleep of a long military transport with hard seats and engine vibration for a lullaby, she drifted into the particular semi-conscious state that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness. In it, with the logic of the half-dreaming mind, she was back on the ridge. Not the recent ridge, an older one. The first long-range qualification she had ever attempted, 3 years earlier, at a training facility in the high desert of New Mexico where the air was thin and the heat rose off the ground in visible sheets and the instructors watch you with the careful neutrality of people who have seen every possible outcome and have agreed among themselves to remain expressionless until the data is in. She had been the only woman on the range that day. She was aware of this with the clarity that you are aware of physical conditions, the weight of the air, the direction of the wind, without it being the thing you focus on. The thing she focused on was the target at 1,800 meters, which was the qualification standard for that level of the program, the distance at which the program confirmed that a shooter understood the relationship between preparation and outcome well enough to be trusted with harder problems. She had gone prone and built her position and run her firing solution with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. And the range instructor, a master sergeant named Gallo who wore his experience in every line of his face and moved with the economy of someone who had eliminated every unnecessary motion from his life years ago, had come to stand behind her left shoulder while she worked. He had not said anything. He stood there in the heat and watched her set her scope and verify her dope and adjust her bipod and settle her breathing. And he had said nothing for all of it. This was, she would later understand, not neutrality. It was attention. Gallo was watching her with the specific attention of someone who knows the difference between a shooter who is going through the sequence and a shooter who understands a sequence, and he was taking his time deciding which one she was. She had fired. Impact had been confirmed inside the first round standard. She had fired a second time to confirm. Second round, same result. Gallo had crouched down beside her position and looked downrange for a moment, as though verifying the distance himself. Then he had said, without looking at her, "Who taught you to read Mirage like that?" "I taught myself," she said. He had looked at her then. "Nobody teaches themselves to read Mirage like that." "I studied fluid dynamics," she said. "And I spent 6 months shooting in desert conditions specifically to build the pattern recognition." Gallo had been quiet for a moment. Then, 6 months. Every weekend. Sometimes during the week if I could get range time. He had stood up, looked at her once more, and said, and she had never forgotten it, carried it in the same interior pocket where she carried the things that mattered. He had said, "You're going to be trouble for the people who underestimate you." He had almost smiled. "Lucky for you, there'll be plenty of them." She woke from the half-dream with the aircraft noise pressing around her and the staff sergeant 3 seats away asleep with his head against the fuselage wall and the loadmaster moving along the cargo bay with a clipboard. She was fully alight within 2 seconds, which was her standard, and she sat with the memory of Gallo's words for a moment before filing them back where they lived. Trouble for the people who underestimate you. She had been, she supposed, exactly that. The C-17 landed at the forward operating base at 0810 local time, and as the ramp lowered in the cold air, the new location replaced the stale air of the aircraft. Elena stood and pulled out her rifle case and shouldered her rucksack and moved toward the light at the bottom of the ramp. Behind her, she heard the staff sergeant's voice, directed at her back, carrying with it a quality different from the beginning of the flight. Less performance, more sincerity. "Hey," he said. "Vasquez." She stopped and looked back. He was standing with his kit, looking at her with the expression of someone who has had a few hours to sit with an incomplete sentence and has decided to finish it properly. "Back there on the ramp," he said, "before we boarded." She waited. "My buddy made a comment about your rifle case," he said. I laughed. He looked at her with the straightforwardness of a man who has decided that honesty is less expensive than the alternative. "I shouldn't have." She studied him for a moment. She thought about what she had told Mason in the helicopter, about the difference between doubting before knowledge and doubting after it. She thought about Hayes and his notebook. She thought about Gallo in the desert heat, crouching beside her position, asking who had taught her to read Mirage. "What's your name?" she said. "Staff Sergeant Aaron Cole," he said. "Cole," she said, "in about 6 months, you're going to hear something about a shot. Doesn't matter where. Someone in your unit will bring it up. When you hear it, you'll know it was this mission." She held his eyes. "When that happens, remember that you apologized before you knew. That matters more than the apology itself." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because apologizing after you know is easy," she said. "Apologizing before, on nothing more than your own honesty, that's character." She turned and walked down the ramp and onto the tarmac of a new location, into the cold morning air of a place she had never been, carrying a rifle and a notebook and 40 hand-loaded rounds and 3 years of preparation for whatever the next problem turned out to be. The briefing was in 4 to 5 minutes. She had time to check her zero. She was already walking toward the range. Ghost never rests. The range at FOB Salerno was a stripped-down affair compared to what she was used to. 300 meters of cleared ground behind a berm of packed earth and sandbags, with paper targets stapled to wooden frames at the far end and a single shooting bench constructed from plywood and 2x4s that had the particular character of something built quickly and used heavily. The kind of range that existed not for training but for confirmation, a place where operators came to verify that the journey had not disturbed what they had carefully set before departure. Elena set up without ceremony. She pulled the Mk-21 from its case, assembled the suppressor, mounted the bipod, and laid the rifle on the bench with the deliberate care of someone who treats the act of preparation as equally important as the act of execution. She pulled her kestrel from her chest pocket and held it level in the morning air, watching the reading settle. Wind from the west-southwest at 7 miles per hour. Temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 61%. Density altitude accounting for the elevation of the FOB, approximately 1,200 feet above sea level, which would give the bullet a marginally flatter trajectory than sea level baseline and require a small downward adjustment from her standard dope. She noted the figures in her notebook without looking down at the page, the way a pianist plays without looking at their hands. Then she loaded a single round, took her position, breathed in, breathed halfway out, and fired. The paper target at 300 meters showed the impact 3 millimeters left of center. She turned one click right on the elevation turret. Fired again. Center. She nodded to herself, replaced the scope caps, and began field stripping the weapon for a second inspection before the briefing. She was halfway through the process when she became aware she was not alone. The man standing 20 meters to her right had been there for perhaps 2 minutes, watching without announcing himself, which she had registered peripherally and catalogued as non-threatening before consciously processing it. He was in his 50s, she estimated, with the specific physical bearing of someone who had been in this work long enough that the work had become structural, built into the way he stood, the way his eyes moved, the way he occupied space with a quiet authority that required no performance. He was wearing civilian clothes, which on a forward operating base told her something specific. He had a coffee mug in his right hand. He was watching her work with the expression of someone who is not watching casually. She finished the strip inspection and began reassembly without acknowledging him, because acknowledging people who chose not to announce themselves was a form of rewarding behavior she had never found productive. He walked over. He stopped at a respectful distance, which she noted, and said, "Captain Vasquez." She did not look up. "Yes, I'm General Harlan Price." He said it the way a person who has held a title long enough gives it, not as an announcement, but as an administrative fact, a piece of information required for the conversation to proceed properly. She looked up then. She recognized the name. Everyone in Special Operations did. General Harlan Price had commanded Joint Special Operations Command through 2 of the most operationally intensive periods in its history. He had a reputation in the community that existed in the specific register of things that do not require exaggeration. A man who had been in the work at every level, from team leader to theater commander, and who had therefore developed the quality possessed by very few people in very large organizations of understanding precisely what it looked like when something real was happening. She stood up and came to attention. "At ease," he said immediately, with the particular ease of a man for whom the formality of the gesture was less interesting than whatever came after it. "I heard about the Paktika engagement." She said nothing. Waited. 2,387 meters, he said. Under 4 seconds of recalculation on a wind shift. First round. He looked at the rifle in her hands, half assembled, the bolt carrier out and resting in her left palm. "Tell me about the hand loads." It was not a question she had been asked by someone of his rank before, and the specificity of it told her that he had already been briefed on the technical details and was asking not for information but for the way she talked about her work. 250-grain Sierra Match King, she said, seated to a consistent depth within 0.03 of an inch across the batch. Propellant charge individually weighed on a precision scale to a variance of less than half a grain. Case necks annealed in uniform before loading. She paused. The consistency reduces the muzzle velocity variance from a factory standard of about 15 feet per second to under 5. At 2,387 meters, that difference represents approximately 4 inches of vertical dispersion. Price was quiet for a moment, looking at the rifle. 4 inches, he said. At that range, 4 inches is the difference between a clean result and a compromised one, she said. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man who already knew this and was confirming that she did too. How long have you been hand-loading? 3 years, sir. On your own time. Ammunition doesn't care whose time it is, she said. Price looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that might have been the early formation of a decision settled slightly, the way a calculation settles when the last variable is confirmed. I've been asked to identify candidates for a new program, he said. SOCOM is standing up a precision interdiction cell. Small, 6 operators, drawn from across the services, cross-trained, deployable as a standalone element for exactly the kind of engagement you conducted in Paktika. He tilted his head slightly. The qualification standard for the program includes a required engagement at 2,200 meters minimum. The current record in the selection process is 2,100 meters. He paused. You've already exceeded it by nearly 300 meters in a live operational context. She reassembled the bolt carrier into the receiver and ran the action twice to confirm the feel. Then she looked at Price. What's the mission profile for the cell? She said. He almost smiled. Not the smile of someone amused, but the smile of someone who has asked a question, not out loud, but internally, the kind of question that begins with, is this the right person, and has just received a satisfactory answer. Because she had not asked about rank or recognition, or what the assignment would mean for her career progression. She had asked about the mission. High-value target interdiction, he said. Extended range. Time-compressed windows. Environments where conventional force cannot operate without unacceptable signature. He looked at her steadily. The kind of work where one shot is the entire operation. Where everything before the shot is the mission and the shot is simply the confirmation of the preparation. She was quiet for a moment. The western wind pressed at them steadily, 7 miles per hour, consistent and honest. Behind the berm, the paper target she had fired at was a pale rectangle in the morning distance. When does selection begin? She said. 3 weeks, Price said. She looked at her rifle. At the rifle case open on the bench beside her. At the notebook, its current volume 3/4 full of data that had been building toward exactly this kind of conversation. I'll need range time between now and selection, she said. You'll have it. And I'll need to know the specific environmental parameters of the selection range. Not to prepare shortcuts, to prepare appropriately. Price looked at her with something that had settled fully now into the expression it had been forming since he first spoke. Colonel Hartwell told me you would say something like that, he said. What did he say exactly? He said, and I'm quoting directly. Price paused, with the quality of someone choosing to share something that they have judged worth sharing. He said, don't brief her on the target. Brief her on the conditions. She'll handle the target. She was handling targets before anyone in that room knew her name. The words landed in the cold morning air and sat there for a moment. She absorbed them with the stillness she brought to all information that carried weight, neither deflecting them nor leaning into them, simply receiving them accurately. Hartwell is generous, she said finally. Hartwell is precise, Price said, with a slight emphasis that returned her own word to her. There's a difference. She looked at him. He looked back. They shared a brief moment of mutual recognition, the kind that requires no elaboration and leaves no residue. Two people who have been in the work long enough to communicate efficiently in the register that the work makes available, where a single well-chosen word does the labor of a paragraph. He left the way he had arrived, without announcement, walking back across the range toward the main compound with the unhurried directness of someone who has delivered what he came to deliver and has other things requiring his attention. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned back to her rifle. The briefing in 4 to 5 minutes would cover the new assignment's operational parameters. After that, she had the afternoon for supplementary range work, the kind of sustained practice that produced the consistency that produced the confidence that produced the stillness at the moment the window opened. She had already calculated in her head the number of rounds she would put through the rifle before selection in 3 weeks. 360, she estimated. 10 sessions of 36 rounds, distributed across the range of conditions she was likely to encounter, with an emphasis on the compressed time wind shift scenarios that had defined the Paktika engagement. 360 rounds. Hand-loaded. Everyone. She reached for her notebook and opened it to a fresh page and began writing the preparation schedule in her careful, precise handwriting, the numbers and dates and conditions arranged in the clean, logical sequence of a plan that had not yet encountered the world but was ready to. While she wrote, she thought about Price's words and Hartwell's words and Mason's words in the helicopter, and about Hayes somewhere back at Bragg working through his SOTIC application with that careful cramped handwriting, and about Webb's radio frequency on the card in her jacket pocket, and about Cole on the C-17 ramp apologizing before he had all the information. She thought about the world that had existed before this work and the world that the work was making, not dramatically, not through speeches or proclamations, but through the accumulation of undeniable moments that shifted what was possible in the minds of people who witnessed them. Hayes applying for SOTIC because a shot had redefined what he understood a shot could be. Cole apologizing before knowledge because something in a brief exchange had recalibrated his honesty instinct. Webb, sitting on a footlocker in her quarters, saying it's a good rifle. 3 words that contained the specific weight of professional respect from a man who gave it rarely and never cheaply. These things were not the mission. They were adjacent to it, produced by it, carried in its wake the way water carries change in the landscape it moves through without intending anything about the landscape at all. She did not think of herself as someone who was making a path. She thought of herself as someone who was doing the work, correctly, consistently, with the full weight of her preparation behind every moment that required it. The path was a consequence. The work was the intention. She finished the preparation schedule, capped her pen, and closed the notebook. She lifted the rifle and sighted downrange at nothing, holding the position for 30 seconds, feeling the familiar weight settle across her hands and forearms and the stock against her cheek and the ocular relief of the scope at the precise distance her face had learned over 8,000 rounds. Everything in its right place. Everything exactly as it should be. She lowered the rifle. In 20 minutes, she would walk into the briefing room and learn the specifics of the next problem. In 3 weeks, she would stand on a selection range in front of a program that would become the most demanding precision interdiction qualification process in the U.S. military, and she would engage a target at a distance that the program had not yet seen someone reach. She did not know this yet. She would not have changed her preparation if she had, because the preparation was not about the distance. It had never been about the distance. The distance was simply where the preparation arrived, a number at the end of a long series of numbers, a result at the bottom of a long column of work that began not on a ridgeline in Afghanistan or a range in New Mexico but in a room, alone, at some dark hour of the morning, with a scale and a case of primers and a decision to understand the problem more completely than the problem expected to be understood. She cased the rifle, shouldered the rucksack, picked up the notebook. The morning wind pressed at her back as she walked toward the briefing room, steady and consistent from the west-southwest, 7 miles per hour. She noted it automatically, filed it without effort, and kept walking. The next ridgeline was always waiting, and she was always ready. Ghost never rests.